Hi, everybody. My name is Rob Wanner, and today I'm going to be talking to you about recent archaeological work that has taken place at Point Lookout Lighthouse, located on the southern tip of a sandy point in St. Mary's County, Maryland. The lighthouse operated continuously from September 1830 to October 1965, when it was replaced by an automatic light in the Potomac. Recent efforts to rehabilitate the structure prompted Phase 2 and subsequently a Phase 3 archaeological investigation in the vicinity of the lighthouse, generating several new features and approximately 10,000 artifacts dating from the Civil War period to the mid-20th century, providing information about the lives of the lighthouse keepers as well as efforts to keep the forces of nature in check. In terms of format, I'm going to go over some of the history, the background of Point Lookout Lighthouse, follow that with the archaeological work, and finally the artifacts. And obviously, this is a different format than that a lot of us are getting used to. So I can't answer questions on the spot. So if you have any questions or comments, my email is on the first slide. I'd be happy to try to answer them or respond to any comments. In terms of location, Point Lookout is located within the boundaries of Point Lookout State Park in St. Mary's County, Maryland, at the confluence between the Potomac River and the Chesapeake Bay. Owing to its location, the point has frequently been subjected to the severe effects of shoreline erosion from sea level rise, winter storms, tropical storms, waves, tides, and coastal flooding. The Maryland Geological Survey has created a series of shoreline change maps, rather, to determine coastal land loss by watershed and by county. You can see in this map that much of the historic surface from the 19th century, along with any archaeological remains with it, are now underwater. And this was the case in the 1970s, I believe, when some archaeological features were found when some bricks from a structure were located off of the beach, the current beach. Tropical storms have also shifted deposits and associated artifacts over the land. Hurricanes have wreaked some of the most destruction on the point within the past century. The strong winds are accompanied by rainfall and storm surge. During Hurricane Isabel in 2003, up to 3 feet of sand had been deposited in some areas at Point Lookout, so that picnic tables and grills were buried and a bobcat was utilized to move sand to other areas. So this activity creates a situation where the point literally folds over onto itself, shifting archaeological deposits and destroying features. Our excavations indicated that the deepest cultural levels encountered were embedded in this variegated layer of sand and gravel pebbles, imitating the tidal action on the surface of the beach. Originally, Point Lookout was part of a massive estate called St. Michael's Manor, owned by the first governor of Maryland. Some of the most interesting events in the early history of Point Lookout involve a murder mystery and at least 4 separate encounters with the British military from 1776 to 1813. But unfortunately, we don't have time to talk about these. Our story really begins in 1826, when 250 acres at the point, including the future site of the lighthouse, was sold to one Mr. Jennifer Taylor. In 1825, the General Assembly for the state of Maryland passed a resolution for territorial jurisdiction over 5.5 acres at Point Lookout for the erection of a lighthouse. Taylor's property had been surveyed by a naval officer, William Barney, who described it as a bleak, barren sand beach for many acres. Barney made an initial offer, $50 per acre, which insulted Taylor. Another assessment was made which valued the property at a much higher rate, and then Taylor built a fence across the road leading to the site. Taylor made another offer. He would sell the property for $500 and the position of lighthouse keeper. The second part was adamantly rejected, and Taylor continued to refuse to sell the property even after the promised price was offered. Nevertheless, under Maryland law, tendering the money gave the federal government title to the land, even without transferring the deed. As such, in September of 1830, the government fenced the property it wanted and began building the lighthouse. It was not until 2 years later that Taylor transferred the deed for his property and received the payment, although he insisted that interest was owed to him from the time of the original offer. Such conflicts between the federal government and private property owners and developers would continue to define the history of Point Lookout. 3 acres was set aside for the lighthouse in 2 tracts. 1 acre was set aside on the Potomac side of the point, which would eventually become the site of the lighthouse. The other tract was 2 acres in size. This is tract E on the deed map. This would come to be known as the garden plot, since this is where the lighthouse keepers and their families conducted their gardening. Most of the garden plot is now eroded into the Chesapeake Bay, and it now comprises much less than 2 terrestrial acres. The Point Lookout Lighthouse was built for $33,350 by John Donahue, a commercial fisherman who built 12 other lighthouses in Maryland between 1825 and 1853. Because acquiring the property had drained most of the appropriate funds for the lighthouse, the keeper's quarters and the lighthouse itself were constructed as a single unit. It was 1.5 stories with a 1-story kitchen. A brick privy and a brick-lined well with a windmill-driven water pump were eventually added to the south of the dwelling. A fence enclosed the yard. The design followed federal specifications, which required all lighthouses to measure 20 feet by 34 feet and to have a small porch or kitchen, an outhouse, and a well. Following the Civil War, the lighthouse was improved a number of times and new structures were added to the vicinity. And most importantly, a coal shed and a buoy shed to the south, which you can see in the 1885 photograph, the coal shed and the buoy shed is to the south of that. The most substantial renovations took place from 1927 to 1928 when the lighthouse was expanded and modernized. The first lighthouse keeper was James Davis, who served at Point Lookout for only a few months until his death in 1830. It's worth noting that his daughter, Anne, was one of the earliest female lighthouse keepers in the country. The head of the lighthouse establishment called her one of our best keepers. The lighthouse served the point for over a century. In 1939, the Coast Guard took over management of the lighthouse, keeping meticulous records which are now located at the National Archives. In 1965, the lighthouse went out of service. The Coast Guard station at Point Lookout was transferred to the Navy in 1967, and the coal and buoy sheds were converted to electronic testing labs. The lighthouse was rented out as a residence to private citizens or park employees for the next several years. In 1980, the lighthouse building was turned over to the U.S. Navy, and in 2006, the property was sold to the Maryland DNR. Just to the north of the federally owned lighthouse property and virtually surrounding the garden plot, private developers began to focus their efforts on making Point Lookout a resort destination. In 1860, a developer established a 50-acre resort immediately to the north of the lighthouse. The resort included a 2-story hotel, a steamboat wharf, and numerous summer cottages. Apparently, the resort was somewhat successful in attracting prominent political and business leaders. Business was interrupted with the outbreak of the Civil War, of course, which resulted in reduced use of the recreational area. The property was leased to the federal government in July in 1862 for the establishment of a Union military hospital. Initially, the hotel and summer cottages were used as hospital wards and other wartime facilities, but this quickly became insufficient for a prolonged war in a battleground state. So the construction of a dedicated hospital was undertaken in 1862. We'll talk about that momentarily. Following the end of the Civil War, there were several attempts at renewing the resort industry from the 1860s rather to 1955, but it never really recovered. Repeated attempts to obtain the property, first through litigation and then through a property swap, were not productive, and it seems like the garden plot was a perpetual thorn in the side of real estate developers. In the 1877 plan, up on the right, you can see how the lighthouse garden was interfering with plans for the summer cottages. And finally, in the 20th century, they kind of planned things around it and accepted that it was going to stay there. In 1964, the state of Maryland began purchasing the same land on Point Lookout to establish Point Lookout State Park. During the earliest days of the Civil War, the resort grounds, augmented by the construction of several new buildings, served as Point Lookout Hospital. By the summer of 1862, however, a major new pavilion hospital was planned to adequately handle the ever-increasing number of battlefield casualties. Construction on the U.S. General Hospital Point Lookout, or Hammond Hospital, began in August of 1862 and took less than a year to complete. The hospital was one of the largest in the Civil War, and it is depicted in this anonymous lithograph on the left. It consisted of 16 buildings arranged like the spokes of a wheel. 15 of these radial buildings were one-story wards with dining and storage rooms at the end of each. Following the Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863, a prisoner of war camp was established at Point Lookout, officially named Camp Hoffman. This is also visible to the north of the hospitals in the lithograph. The facility was pushed well beyond its capacity in 1864 with a population of 15,500, and as a result, conditions were dismal for the prisoners. You can see the barn sketches on the right, which were drawn by a prisoner in the camp. Approximately 4,000 of the 50,000 Confederate soldiers who passed through the prison camp died there. Following the war, the buildings of the hospital were torn down and sold for scrap. A detailed announcement of the public auction held January 18, 1866 was first made in the newspaper National Republican, and it provides an interesting and detailed view of the Point Lookout landscape immediately after the Civil War. The buildings were all dismantled with materials auctioned off by December of 1866. A formal archaeological identification survey was performed in 1995 next to the lighthouse and identified site 18ST61 as comprising the remains of Hammond Hospital and deposits associated with the Point Lookout Lighthouse. A total of 385 shovel test bits at 25-foot intervals and 16 test units were excavated during the Phase 1 survey. The survey recorded more than 150,000 artifacts. No structural remains of Hammond Hospital were detected, but the footprint of the building was identified based on the distribution of composition roofing material, which you can see on the right with the location of the hospital kind of superimposed, and there you can really see on this map how much of the how much of the structure would now be underwater. Several test units were also located next to the lighthouse. 2 layers of buried topsoil were identified, which contained several 20th century features, including tree molds and 2 structural footers. Test units on the western side of the lighthouse recorded numerous deposits dating to the 1927 and 1928 renovations, and later than that. The lack of a stratigraphic record from the 19th century in the vicinity of the lighthouse was explained by subsurface disturbance during the renovations that disturbed or mixed the earlier deposits. The area around the south, to the south of the lighthouse, where the coal shed and the buoy shed, and the areas along the Potomac and Chesapeake shorelines were found to be heavily disturbed by 20th century erosion control and construction. So these results were used to generate an area of archaeological sensitivity, which we use to formulate our Phase 2 and Phase 3 work plans. So some of the more unique challenges that were presented to us during the Phase 2 and Phase 3 work, I want to kind of lay these out for you. So the first issue is a common one, and that is that there were financial constraints on the work. This created a situation where we had to delay the final inventorying and reporting of the field work and the final inventorying of the artifacts and the reporting by actually a year until funds could be found to cover those costs. These are not, uncommon problems, so we have a standard protocol for dealing with them. But more unique were the challenges due to groundwater and the artifacts. So due to infiltration of groundwater, when we reached a certain depth of excavation, things had to move very, very rapidly when we got down below to about 50 centimeters. Profiles collapsed. You can see the profile there on the left. We didn't even get a photo of that one, unfortunately. That was the first time that it happened, and we adapted after that occurred. There was nothing we could do. The water just started flowing in. So occasionally we had to sketch things out very quickly and then augment it with photographs in Photoshop. This situation was exacerbated by the fact that the phase 3 work was moving forward in the late fall when rain and flooding were actually intensifying and getting worse. So we had to move very quickly overall. The effects of storms and flooding on both the conditions of artifacts and their distribution also obscured our interpretation of them occasionally. Some artifacts recovered from both features and historic strata were very badly abraded or corroded. You can see a photo of 2 of them at the top. As a result, numerous iron artifacts with heavy corrosion are often cataloged as miscellaneous. Metal artifacts and ceramics were often classified as general whiteware or stoneware, since glaze, along with any decoration, had been sanded off. While early features were often identifiable based on their stratigraphic position, and frequently because they contained diagnostic metal artifacts or large ceramic sherds, numerous mixed 19th and 20th century materials were present throughout different strata beneath the first few layers of topsoil and sandy wash. Features did not frequently contain large amounts of lighter materials. In some cases, they contained no diagnostic artifacts at all. We understood this to be an effect of storm waves, which wash out the smaller and lighter artifacts from the sand, leaving behind larger and heavier artifacts. Lighter artifacts eroded in this way would usually accumulate in secondary concentrations. So we get artifacts transported from their original location, both mixed spatially, displaced in various stratigraphic deposits, and also within these shallow pit features. So a total of 31 features were recorded in the phase 2 and phase 3 work, generally dating from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century, basically from the Civil War to the closure of the lighthouse. We did not recover any artifacts which suggested association with pre-Civil War use of the site or Point Lookout. More recent deposits from hurricanes and tropical storms conveniently capped all the historic features, so they were easy to pick out. One category of features dated to the 20th century are associated with a major campaign of renovations in 1927 and 1928. 5 features were identified that were compressed concentrations of rubble and demolition materials and hardware, which are likely associated with this campaign. Piles of rubble surrounding the lighthouse on its north, south, and east sides are visible in the 1928 photograph up there. Flooding episodes, along with grading and landscaping, have distributed these materials through the upper stratigraphic layers of the site. But the largest, most compacted piles of debris did not completely disperse and left archaeological traces where they were deposited. A second category of features appears as these irregularly shaped, shallow pit features to the south and east of the lighthouse. At least 8 of these were dated to the 19th century based on their contents and their stratigraphic positions. They are cut directly into the sandy subsoil. At least 3 others appear to have been filled in the 20th century. Almost every feature excavated contained large proportions of heavier, denser artifacts, including brick, iron hardware, and shell. The deposit of a broken quartz point in one of these features, sea glass in another, and heavily weathered ceramic in yet another indicate that some of the materials may be secondary deposits associated with flooding episodes and eventual recession of the waters. You can see how the shape is highly irregular for something like a post hole or something. Nevertheless, several features were small and circular in shape, and we did interpret them as possible post holes. These features did not resemble typical post holes that might be found at other sites, due to their sometimes irregular shape and plan and profile as a result of flooding and possibly wind aeolian processes that have profoundly affected the beach. Large splinters, likely from wooden posts, were recovered from one of the features pictured there, and also from stratigraphic layers that were above the features. The distance between the bottom centers of the pits along the eastern side of the lighthouse are all approximately 10 feet apart. That is between 9 and 11 feet. These features are set out 12 feet from the eastern entrance, the eastern elevation, eastern foundation of the lighthouse, and are oriented in a line parallel to it. Two other post holes at the bottom there, feature 28, feature 29, are set out 30 feet to the south of the lighthouse, and are also approximately 11 feet apart, but in a parallel line to the south elevation of the lighthouse. An 1865 plan of Point Lookout indicates that fence posts or the early fence surrounding the lighthouse are situated approximately 10 feet apart from one another, even if the fence depicted does not line up with the features identified. So the orientation of the fences and the building suggests the possibility that these features represent another iteration of that boundary around the lighthouse and have been kind of severely affected, with the sides collapsing in to give these post holes their current shape. Several features were also associated with landscaping, planting holes for ornamental trees and shrubs, barriers against erosion, and drainage ditches. Part of the north of the lighthouse, feature 10, a V-shaped drainage ditch appears to have channeled water in the garden plot toward the south. An early sidewalk was also identified to the east of the lighthouse. Feature 23 is likely a planting hole. It's in the position of one of the large shrubs that's visible in the 1950s photograph to the left there. Extensive landscaping appears to have taken place under the Coast Guard. Feature 33 was identified to the southeast of the lighthouse, between the lighthouse and the coal shed. The top of the feature was initially exposed beneath stratum 3 at approximately 25 centimeters below the surface. The feature was lined with a thin fabric sheet covered on both sides with tar, sand, and small pebbles. It was vertical for approximately 14 centimeters before curving inward towards the bottom to line the bottom. The feature contained 3 distinct deposits within it. The material lining this feature may be a repurposed roll of roofing material. We found composition roofing quite frequently to the north of the lighthouse. While sand and gravel were only applied to one side of the roll of felt for roofing needs, it appears on both sides of the felt lining feature 33, and this is probably due to the saturated tar adhering to the natural sand and gravel in the soil rather than being an intentional and unnecessary application of aggregate to both sides. So what is this? As far as its function, we can speculate based on historic sketches and photographs. Black material projecting very slightly from the surface appears on the east side of the lighthouse, oriented north-south, in a photograph taken in the 1920s, prior to the substantial renovations of 1927 and 1928. The material appears to form a barrier between the lush lawn on the south side of the lighthouse and a barren beach to the east. The material is still visible in 1928, taken after the renovations, although the turf has been removed. Thus, the material appears to have been installed at some point during the late 19th century and was covered over by new sod after 1928, which exists today. The material appears to have acted as a barrier against shifting sands caused by both water and wind. The layer of gravel beneath the soil, beneath the feature, drained the soil easily, which allowed the turf applied over the top to thrive. In any case, this turf was removed in 1927 and 1928 and replaced by new turf along with ornamental vegetation and paved walkways, which remain to this day. Feature 15 consisted of a brick pier associated with rubble comprising the northeast corner of the mechanical fog bell tower, constructed to the southeast of the lighthouse in November of 1872. To the east of the brick surface, there was a terracotta drainage pipe oriented north-south and entering both the north and south profiles of our limits of excavation. As soon as the plan was fully exposed and we were able to draw it relatively quickly, water flooded everything, so it was underwater by the time we were backfilling. The brick pier measured 32 inches long by 32 inches wide, confirming the known measurements for this structural for this structure. Originally, the piers were 42 inches tall and were set approximately 30 inches into the ground. The remaining 3 brick piers for the tower and the well in the center of the tower were not excavated during the Phase 3 efforts. As you can see, the tower is fully visible in the photograph taken in 1885. The fog bell tower was replaced by a mechanical, was replaced by a newer one in 1888. Demolition layers above the brick surface containing asbestos roof shingle fragments indicated that the structure was leveled in the early 20th century. A photograph taken in the 1920s shows a whitewashed block where the fog bell tower stood in the earlier 1885 photograph. The pier is not visible in any later photographs of the lighthouse. Following the Phase 3 work, we recommended monitoring to avoid this feature and the other 3 piers that were likely located there. Luckily, someone in DNR stepped up and on March 13, 2019, monitored excavation in the same area, exposed this pier yet again, as well as the northwest brick pier, which was not exposed during the Phase 3 efforts. The distance between the 2 piers was 91 inches, and the excavator was able to trench between the 2 piers to avoid their destruction. An earlier trench excavated for the electrical line to the south of the piers appears to have destroyed the southeast pier of the bell tower, and a concentration of brick rubble in the trench was approximately 91 inches. So these measurements indicate the tower occupied a pretty sizable footprint of approximately 160 square feet. Artifacts from the Phase 2 and Phase 3 excavations were grouped together for analysis. A total of 9,985 artifacts were recorded during both phases. The overall assemblage is notable for its relatively high percentage of structural materials related to maintenance and renovations of the lighthouse and other buildings, in relation to a relatively low percentage of domestic materials reflecting the daily lives of the inhabitants of the lighthouse over a similar time span. The ratio of structural materials to domestic artifacts is more than 7:1. In total, only 694 artifacts, or 14% of the entire assemblage recovered, were classified in the domestic group. This is notable since observations made during the Phase 1 investigations indicated that the general paucity of domestic artifacts, quote, may be explained by the convenience of the river and the bay for refuse disposal. However, rules governing the behavior of lighthouse keepers as government employees may have also influenced the deposition at the lighthouse. We must consider that most faunal artifacts and many artifacts that could not be definitively identified may also constitute domestic refuse from the lighthouse. However, in the former case, most faunal artifacts consisted of oyster shell, which most likely does not represent food remains, which were naturally deposited. In the latter case, we determined that most of the items that we initially classified as indefinite use consisted of iron hardware and were not related to domestic refuse. We'll talk in a second about how that determination was made. The pattern thus appears to be real and not a product of the methodology. Structural materials included brick, mortar, window glass, concrete, asbestos shingles, composition roofing, and various other structural artifacts. So these were not notable except for a few exceptions. As expected, most of the composition roofing material was recovered in the area to the north of the lighthouse in the former location of Hammond Hospital, which utilized this form of roofing. Composition roofing was easy to distinguish from asphalt concrete based on the presence of one smooth, flat surface where it adhered to the fabric. Again, this looks very much like early asphalt, but you can tell the difference because of that one smooth side. Hundreds of nails were recovered, both wire and cut. 5 cut nails made from a copper alloy, which resisted corrosion, were recovered from around the lighthouse. Each one of them measured 3.5 to 3.7 centimeters in length, and their heads were mostly rounded. They were identified as boat nails used for general fastening of ships and docks. 3 examples appeared to have never been used, while 2 others had bent shanks, so have been clearly warped when they were pulled. Numerous miscellaneous metal items were recovered from the site during the excavations, many which were too small and corroded to interpret. Given the daily maintenance activities performed at the lighthouse and the buoy depot to the south, the presence of small pieces of metal is not unexpected. The 1857 rules, regulations, and general instructions issued by the lighthouse establishment describe numerous metal instruments that might be present in a lighthouse establishment: bells, cast iron sinkers, ballast balls for buoys, all of cast metal, and tools, implements, and fixtures of wrought metal. In addition, numerous thin, long, corroded pieces of iron were initially believed to be iron nails, even though this was unverified at the time. To better distinguish the hardware and ubiquitous structural metal materials from other materials that might provide other forms of information, we arranged to have the samples of the corroded materials from various contexts x-rayed at a place near our office, the nearby Mount Washington Pediatric Hospital. The radiographic images were used in identifying nails from among the most corroded specimens, and the catalog was updated with this new information. 2 interesting yet intermittent metal objects were identified in the process, both pictured on the left side of the X-ray image there. One rectangular metal item on the bottom was recovered from feature 34 south of the lighthouse, which likely predates the construction of the bell tower, so earlier than the late 19th century. It looks like there's 2 panels there embossed with some flowers or butterflies. We're not exactly sure. In addition, a portion of a flat, rounded object with embossed letters was also identified. You can barely make out the letters at the top there. Oops. Having been recovered from a 19th century deposit to the east of the lighthouse. This contained structural and domestic artifacts and is associated with the use of the lighthouse. These objects are now both undergoing conservation at the Mac Lab, so hopefully we will have more information on this soon. Artifacts related to clothing, accoutrements, and firearms were among the most informative materials about the Civil War period use of the site. These were generally recovered from the pit features adjacent to the lighthouse and strata deposited immediately over the top of the features. With regard to clothing, a total of 9 buttons were recovered from the investigations made from porcelain, copper alloy, and iron alloy. The most interesting button was a brass 4-hole sew-through button recovered from feature 5 south of the lighthouse. The center of the button was punched through, indicating possible reuse, maybe as a token for gaming. None of the metal buttons could be definitively associated with federal lighthouse uniforms or Civil War period uniforms. One Union officer's sword belt plate was recovered from the bottom of the pit feature. The plate is a high-grade cast brass plate displaying pattern 1851, consisting of an eagle, shield, and scroll with the motto E pluribus unum. 2 puppy paw copper alloy belt plates were also recovered from feature 1 to the south of the lighthouse. The buckles are oval, following the federal regulations of 1839, and were designed to secure a belt fitted over a soldier's jacket. The U.S. stamp belt buckle plates originally possessed 3 copper alloy prongs for use with the U.S. regulation waist belt. In both cases, they have been broken off. One belt plate, the one on the right, has a rectangular imprint on the front as if it were struck. Both were manufactured between 1839 and 1865. A unique type of copper alloy hardware from a Maryland cavalry saber belt was recovered from Feature 13 to the east of the lighthouse. This piece is a rivet used to attach the sword hanger hooks to the leather straps. Within the same context, a knapsack hook was recovered, which was surrounded by corrosion and attached to an iron mass. The flat iron piece to which it is attached is likely a broken knife blade. Due to the unique shape of the knapsack hook, it was identified as an Isaacs Campbell import knapsack hook. The London-based company was a supplier of goods to the Confederacy. A copper alloy attachment ring recovered in 3 pieces from immediately to the southwest of the lighthouse also formed part of a sword belt. This rounded square ring made of round copper alloy has been broken into 3 pieces at some point, but when reassembled, it matches the thickness and dimension of the accoutrement. A total of 10 fragments of iron alloy straight pins were also recovered from the east of the lighthouse, as well as south of the lighthouse near to the coal shed. Given that these straight pins generally occurred alongside Civil War period accoutrements, it seems likely that they were part of the compact sewing kits known as housewives that soldiers might carry in their knapsack. These were usually made of scraps of fabric, leather, and could be folded or rolled and fastened with ribbon, yarn, or a button. They contained essential sewing supplies so that a soldier could sew on a button or mend a tear in the field. In addition, small fragments of corroded iron with circular ribs might be interpreted as standard bullseye canteens, but they were much too corroded to make that assessment with certainty. Given the broken condition of all of these Civil War items, it seems likely that they were tossed aside when they were no longer useful. The presence of Confederate artifacts alongside Union artifacts is suspicious. A photograph of the Confederate prisoners at Point Lookout, taken in 1865, shows the soldiers there without their accoutrements, but within their uniforms. They have no belts, no canteens, no knapsacks. It seems likely that after disarming and stripping the prisoners of their accoutrements, broken and worn pieces were eliminated in the same way as decommissioned Union accoutrements, possibly from the hospital. A total of 24 artifacts were recovered that were classified in the firearms category. The assemblage reflected 2 distinct periods, a Civil War period mini balls and gunflints, and the late 19th and 20th century shell casings for rifles. 2 3-band 58 caliber mini balls were recovered from the lower strata to the east of the lighthouse. An additional flattened and folded piece of lead, roughly the same size as a mini ball, preserving a partial groove, was recovered from a feature just to the north of the coal shed. This was interpreted possibly as a modified mini ball, but it might also be a piece of shrapnel. We based that assessment on the results of the phase 1, which recovered a 43 caliber mini ball carved to a gaming piece that was recovered from the plow zone. 2 pieces of chert and 1 piece of flint were recovered that were interpreted as gunflint. One of the chert specimens was heavily corroded and weathered from a context with other heavily weathered glass and corroded metal. Interestingly, these 2 pieces of technology are a testament to the modernization of warfare in the Civil War and the transition from flintlock rifles to rifled muskets. Among the items cataloged as miscellaneous metal items was 1 wire loop that was cut at its base, recovered from an earlier deposit east of the lighthouse. Although not enough survives of the implement to be certain, the piece looks very similar to the end of a friction primer used to initiate the firing of muzzle-loading cannons. Interestingly, unlike Civil War period accoutrements and clothing, which were found in very localized 19th century contents in the features surrounding the lighthouse, the lowest, earliest features surrounding the lighthouse, and the layers immediately above them, these firearms artifacts were not found associated with them. They were found in upper layers, disturbed, mixed contexts. that was essentially the extent of the Civil War period material. So the remainder of the artifacts we're discussing, we believe, reflect the lives of the lighthouse keepers and their families. In regards to the tablewares, most of what we found was general whiteware. We did find one in situ whiteware, almost intact whiteware lid, which was very interesting. Unfortunately, it contained no diagnostic or decoration characteristics that would give us chronological markers. We were looking, in regards to ceramics, we were looking in particular for wares associated with the resort industry to the north, and we did not find any, unfortunately. So of note, 7 fragments of Victorian majolica ware were recovered from Feature 1 to the south of the lighthouse, which meant to create the handle of an indefinite hollow vessel, likely a drinking vessel. This was found in the same context as some of the Civil War period items. Victorian majolica was manufactured from 1851 to 1914, and other fragments of this type of ware were also recovered from other contexts, a mixed context in the same area. A total of 10 porcelain fragments from tableware vessels were recovered. 3 fragments appear to be a very fine hard paste porcelain, likely Japanese based on the paste, possibly all from the same vessel. All 3 pieces are decorated with cobalt blue underglazed painting, and 1 fragment is decorated with a cobalt blue semi-geometric or floral pattern, possibly displaying the Chinese character for mountain, Shan, the character on the left side of the image. Another fragment displays a chrysanthemum motif, which is common on Japanese export porcelain. The presence of porcelain vessels, regardless of whether they originate from China or Japan, indicates the usage of finer, more expensive tableware or toiletries at the Point Lookout Lighthouse. Non-shell artifacts, which also reflect foodways of the inhabitants, were also found only in small quantities. Over 92% of the faunal artifacts were oyster shell. 3 campaigns of archaeological investigations have determined that most of the shell was concentrated in soils that were identified as fill, associated with erosion control or alluvial deposits. There were only a few times when oyster shell was recovered from artifacts, was recovered from features that are that was found in association with bone or other faunal artifacts, suggesting deliberate disposal. A total of 119 fragments of bone were recovered across 10 units. Mammals represented the largest class, followed by avian, which included some crow specimens, and fish. The most informative mammal remains within this assemblage was actually pig, with an MNI, a minimum number of individuals of 3. A majority of the identified pig remains were femur bones, indicating there may have been a preference or availability of those type of meat cuts. In addition, a cow cervical vertebra and a rabbit femur were also identified, providing an MNI for 2 for each of these mammals. The remaining mammal fragments were too fragmented for positive identification. Out of the 57 mammal bones, 5 fragments, 2 of which were pig, contained saw marks or cut marks on them. With regard to leisure activities, a total of 14 shell casings were recovered from the area south of the lighthouse. All were 22 caliber except for 2, one which is a 32 caliber Smith & Wesson center fire cartridge, as evidenced by a stamp on it. Shotgun shells and casings are associated with the target shooting practiced by inhabitants of the lighthouse. A 1959 photograph on the left documents a family of Kenny Hopkins, assistant keeper from 1958 to 1959, doing just that. As the shotgun shells documents a leisure activity practiced not only by lighthouse staff, but also their families from the late 19th century to the early 20th century. A total of 17 fragments of alcohol-related artifacts were recovered during the Phase 2 and Phase 3 investigations. All of the chronologically diagnostic artifacts for this category were manufactured in the 20th century. A total of 6 fragments manufactured by the Gottlieb Bauernschmidt Strauss Brewing Company of Baltimore, all likely from the same bottle, were recovered from a test unit within the garden plot. The Baltimore brewery is only open for 9 years, 1901 to 1910. Another fragment from the same context also likely belongs to a Gottlieb Bauernschmidt Strauss bottle. Lacks necessary identification, the embossing. The first instructions issued by the Lighthouse Board in 1852 prohibited the sale of liquor on the lighthouse property and required the lighthouse keeper to be sober and industrious. Over time, the rules grew stricter and more explicit. The 1889 instructions state that the keeper found intoxicated is not only summarily dismissed from his service, but he is instantly ejected from the station. As such, it matters, it makes sense that all of these beer bottles were found in the garden plot. Tobacco smoking, on the other hand, was not prohibited. Interestingly, only a single tobacco-related artifact was recovered from the Phase 2 and Phase 3 investigations. 2 kaolin tobacco pipe stem fragments from a single pipe were recovered from adjacent to the lighthouse, produced by the William White firm of Glasgow, which was in operation from 1805 to 1955. 4 medicine bottle fragments were recovered during the Phase 2 and Phase 3 work, but only one of these was identifiable. A body fragment of a bottle of Shaker digestive cordial was recovered from TU-20 to the east of the lighthouse, sold from 1880s to 1910 by A.J. White Limited out of New York. This patent medicine was recommended to treat indigestion. The medicine contained alcohol, which could also have been used to circumvent rules about alcoholic consumption. This, along with 2 comb fragments, appear to be the only artifacts associated with grooming and health of the lighthouse occupants. It is, however, suspicious that while some small amounts of structural materials were left behind by the Civil War hospital, as well as accoutrements and firearms, sometimes in mixed contexts, sometimes in earlier features, no materials associated with the Civil War medicine or medical activities were recovered. The fate of medical supplies following the closing of the hospital was most likely public auction. If medical supplies were in any way salvageable, they would have been transported off-site for sale, just like the structural materials from the hospital. Surplus medical supplies were sold by the Army Medical Department for over $4 million at the end of the war. These investigations at Point Lookout have provided important information about the history of the lighthouse from the Civil War to the mid-20th century. First of all, it's aided our understanding of how the landscape at the point was modified to combat the natural forces at work. The landscape around the lighthouse was shaped by human responses to erosive forces of wind and water. The very fact that the southern tip of the point is not eroded away completely is due to measures over the past century to stabilize the shorelines. Archaeological work has contributed additional information about how this landscape was shaped and altered through the identification of fence posts, the use of fabric, possibly repurposed roofing material to create a barrier around the lighthouse lawn and protect against erosion, and planting holes. It's also clarified how these natural processes have altered and shaped the archaeological record on the point, ensuring that no pre-19th century features remain, at least near the lighthouse. The work has also clarified some aspects of the lives of the lighthouse keepers and their families. We know now that while the inhabitants of the lighthouse may have made an effort to maintain a clean facility, it's questionable whether the yard was truly clean at any given point from the late 19th century to the 20th centuries. Features to the east and south of the lighthouse contain, on average, twice as many structural materials as domestic and personal items. They have not swept these artifacts into the sea or deposited them elsewhere. 19th and early 20th century structural materials of substantial size were evenly distributed both vertically and horizontally across the entire yard in areas that we investigated. And it's difficult to imagine that they were not visible. A few of these were not visible on the ground. In fact, piles of structural debris are visible in piles on the surface in 1928 photographs that we looked at earlier. In addition, lighter refuse materials were likely carried away by the water over the past century. The fact that heavier materials survive in primary deposits is a fortunate accident indeed. We also have evidence that lighthouse keepers may not have strictly followed federal rules on alcoholic abstinence. The leisure activities involved smoking and shooting. The pork and cow were consumed along with animals more likely hunted, like rabbit and crow, and that an occasional indulgence in fine imported tableware was made more than once, likely at personal expense rather than tax dollars. We look forward to completing and contrasting this data with other domestic assemblages from lighthouses as more work is completed in the Mid-Atlantic area. So thank you for your time.